If you've ever set foot in a corporate office, you have almost certainly had this book pushed across your desk at some point. Well, let's dive right into this explainer and perform a cold forensic autopsy on Simon Sinek's ubiquitous text, Start With Why. Today, we are completely stripping away the fan energy, the motivational hype, and the roaring TED Talk applause to examine this book's raw, structural anatomy. We're going to look strictly at what the text actually argues, using its own claims against itself.
Here is our surgical clipboard for today's procedure. We've got 1. The initial incision. 2. The strongest muscle. 3. The weakest bone. 4. The collapsing argument. And finally, 5. The final verdict.
Part 1. The initial incision. We are looking at myth versus text. Let's make our first cut by comparing the cultural myths surrounding this book with the author's own explicit disclaimer right there in the introduction.
Okay, let's place our subject on the table. This is a text that has heavily influenced Hollywood, the Pentagon, Microsoft, and Wall Street. It's completely driven by one core premise, and it is vital we remember that this is just a hypothesis we are about to test, that inspiring leaders and organizations always start with why they do things rather than what they do.
Now, right out of the gate, there's a really stark juxtaposition between how society consumes this text and what it actually is. Society treats Start With Why as this prescriptive step-by-step business manual for corporate strategy. But look at the author's own admission. He literally writes, its goal is not to give you a course of action. Its goal is to offer you the cause of action. Right away, the author is telling us this is absolutely not a how-to guide.
The book actually kicks off its first chapter with a really clever structural trick, just to prove how easily we can be misled. It describes a 43-year-old Roman Catholic man sworn in as chief executive in January, whose predecessor was a famous general. It perfectly sets up the reader to assume it's describing John F. Kennedy. And then, the twist. It reveals it's actually January 1933, and the man is Adolf Hitler. It's a pretty intense reminder of how easily we, and the leaders we follow, can be misdirected by a good story based on incomplete information.
Moving on to Part 2, The Strongest Muscle, Carrots and Sticks. As we go deeper into the anatomy, we isolate the vital organs to find the absolute strongest chapter of the book.
This is Chapter 2's clinical breakdown of how companies manipulate consumers. Sinek correctly categorizes standard business practices not as savvy marketing, but as raw manipulations. Whether it's politicians using fear, organizations leaning on peer pressure, or companies pushing price rebates and promotions, the argument establishes that, sure, these tactics work perfectly in the short term, but they rely on base survival drives and ultimately erode your profit margins and your organizational strength over time.
And the book makes a really compelling case here that these manipulations create a toxic baseline. Citing Peter Wybrow's research in American Mania, the findings show that these short-term gains are quite literally destroying our health. They're raising stress levels, causing ulcers, and fueling depression by overloading the reward circuits of our brain. So let's file this away in our forensic notes. The text definitively establishes that fear and peer pressure are destructive manipulations that degrade human health.
Which brings us to Part 3, The Weakest Bone, Opinion versus Biology. We're now shifting our scalpel to examine the exact point where the text attempts to graft hard science onto soft organizational theory.
You see, the framework presented here isn't just suggested as a neat idea. In Chapter 4, a massive claim is explicitly made right in the section's title. It says, "This is not opinion, this is biology." It confidently asserts that the human need to organize around a why is rooted deeply in our neurobiology and evolutionary survival.
So, as investigators, our crucial point is testing this massive claim. When we examine the actual evidence provided to support this so-called biology, what do we find? Well, we find historical anecdotes. We get the story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Believe speeches. We get tales of Steve Wozniak at Apple. We even get hypothetical scenarios about cavemen leaving the den to hunt because they trust their community. It's fascinating storytelling for sure, but we have to note on the autopsy report that anecdotal storytelling does not actually constitute biological or physiological evidence. The biological framing begins to heavily hemorrhage right here.
Let's move into Part 4, The Collapsing Argument. Time for the talk screen. We're going to see how this builds into a critical internal contradiction, a place where the argument completely collapses under its own weight. To run this talk screen, we have to clearly remind ourselves of the text's own definitions. Remember Chapter 2? Fear, dystopian warnings, and agitating people's insecurities are explicitly categorized as toxic manipulations that destroy organizational health. That is the book's own undisputed baseline rule. But here is where the logic totally flatlines. Using Sinek's own words, we place his condemnation of fear-based marketing right next to his absolute glowing praise of Apple's famous 1984 commercial. He describes this ad as an Orwellian scene of a totalitarian regime holding control over a population, just drone people in a sea of gray conformity. Yet, he champions this terrifying dystopian nightmare as a poetic ode to Apple's why, labeling it pure inspiration. This completely contradicts his earlier rule that leveraging fear and dystopian imagery is a toxic manipulation.
And honestly, the logic fractures even further in Chapter 9, when looking at corporate symbols. Sinek praises the Harley-Davidson tattoo as a prime example of inspiration, a symbol of clear values and beliefs. But listen to how he describes the actual effect of this tattoo. He notes that when a guy walks into a bar with a huge Harley logo on his arm, we take a step back and give him a wide berth. Wait a minute. The fear and intimidation elicited by a biker gang tattoo are celebrated here as pure, authentic inspiration? Isn't that the exact peer pressure and manipulation he just spent 30 pages condemning?
Part 5. The Final Verdict. Let's read the coroner's report. Having mapped the strong muscles against the broken bones, we are finally ready to finalize our findings on this book.
Clinically speaking, the structural causes of death for the internal logic are pretty clear-cut. It claims the authority of hard biology, but relies entirely on historical anecdote. It strictly defines fear as a manipulation, but then champions fear-based marketing and intimidation as profound inspiration, as long as it comes from favored brands like Apple or Harley-Davidson. The self-contradictory logic simply collapses when tested against its own definitions.
But here's where we have to step back from the autopsy table for a second. If the internal anatomy is this fundamentally flawed, and the logic contradicts itself so blatantly, we have to ask ourselves, why does this book survive? What is this text's undeniable cause of immortality in the corporate world?
The verdict is that its immortality stems not from scientific accuracy nor from flawless internal logic. It survives because it brilliantly articulates a profound, instinctual human desire. We all desperately crave to feel that our daily work, our grueling 8-hour shifts, and our endless oceans of emails actually belong to a larger, meaningful cause. Sinek gave corporate society a vocabulary for that exact craving. So I leave you with this to consider. Does a business philosophy actually need to be scientifically true and logically flawless to change the world? Or does it only need to tell us exactly what we are desperate to hear?